Hello friends. I'm going to do something a little different today. I've been getting a lot of people asking me where to start with reading my books. I also kind of wanted to make a video about where I'm going with the books because I talk about them a lot. I'm going through my old sketchbooks. It's going to take me a while to get the story down clearly. If you don't want any spoilers whatsoever, you probably should avoid this channel entirely because I'm just not that fussy about it. But I am going to bring up some broad spoilers as far as who gets together with whom and what kids they have and the general world history, how it's going to unfold. It's very broad stuff. I'm not going to get into the tiny details of how it all happens. And frankly, as a storyteller and as a reader, my favorite reason to want to read a story is just because I want to spend more time in the world and with the characters. Like a lot of times when you read a good shoujo manga, you already know it's going to end with the couple getting married. You might have already seen the last volume and they're in wedding clothes and you know where it's going. But you just want to see how it unfolds and spend as much time with those characters as possible. Those are the kind of stories that I really love, not ones that are dependent on who turns out to be whose father and what plot twist. But if you don't like spoilers, you probably don't want to watch this video. But anyway, what I'm going to do today is as I talk about the books, I'm going to sketch the characters. And this video is just very chatty and chill. I've just been tired. I have been having kind of a flare-up of anxiety. It hasn't been the best week. It's also very hot. So I wanted to do something that just feels cozy to me. I did have a nice little cheer up moment. This week though, one of our friends stopped by completely spontaneously and him and his wife just got back from Heroes Con and Wendy and Richard Pini were there and they got me a signed ElfQuest print signed to me from Wendy and Richard. And it was such a surprise. I really wanted to go meet them, but I just couldn't justify going to Charlotte just to meet the Peenies. And, I'm more of an anime, manga, JRPG nerd generally, so I'm waiting for the Siege video game convention to be my summer treat. But that was such a nice surprise. But besides that, the week's been a little blah. But let's have some fun anyway. I'm gonna sketch and, my sketches, they're not the best. And part of the reason for that is my entire life I've sketched everything in straight pen spontaneously. And you might think, maybe you should start doing things in pencil and then inking it and then you could improve and your work would be more polished. I'm not really trying to be a professional artist here, and I've also realized it's really hard to make that switch because the line you want to put down is very different and what I end up drawing is very stiff. So even though the pen art is not as professional, I kind of feel like it has more life to it. So I'm sticking with my straight pen, which means this is just chaos and I'll probably make some mistakes. And if you are new here, my name is Lydia Foxglove and I am a fantasy author. For a lot of my career, I have been writing I started in young adult traditional publishing and then I moved into romance, indie publishing, and neither of those things were really my true passion, which is this fantasy world I've been working on since I was 11. Now I'm finally really digging into that world. I currently have 5 books out that are set in it, and there's a lot more to come. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Good morning. Disheveled editing Lydia here. So I'm going back over the footage and realizing that I stuck my head into the frame throughout this video. It's definitely not my best work, that's for sure. So I'm just going to insert various pictures of the characters I've drawn over the years in lieu of my head. Okay, I fussed around with it a while and realized the light ring works a little better. There's just kind of not any room for my actual body around all the equipment, so see how well this goes. Yeah, I'm just not going to be able to keep the paper quite straight. And first I'm going to start with a little bit about what happens before any of the books that I've even written. The main concept of this fantasy world is that it is a rather traditional fantasy world with sorcerers and dragons. In ancient times, they had a way of accessing our world through a magical portal. Oh, I think I'm drawing Sairi just kind of by accident. They had a way of accessing our world through a magical portal like very long time ago, and they would trade with us. You know, probably some kind of craziness happened in our world where they were like, nah, we don't want to deal with these people anymore. So they closed the portal, and then they just totally lost track of how to even do the portal for a very long time. So hundreds, if not thousands of years pass, and Lord Jaren comes to power. He is the High Sorcerer, also known as the Hand of Fate, or in their language, the Wojanaroon. And he is a younger man who takes over this powerful position. And he is really a brilliant strategist. First, he manages to get hold of one of the great crystals that are held by the Miralem. I should probably mention before anything else, the three main races of this world are the Miralem, who have telepathic powers, the Daramons, who can only use sorcery. Their lifespan has been a little shorter traditionally. The Miralem live to be about 180, whereas the Daramons only live to be about 120. And then there are the Finarlem, who are doll people created to be slaves. So Lord Jaren is a brilliant strategist who manages to get a hold of one of the great crystals, and the spells that he creates for his people extend their lifespan and make them much harder to kill, and therefore he becomes a very beloved spiritual leader for the Daramon people. To give our boys some eyeliner here. This is like very rough sketching because I have barely ever drawn Lord Jaren. Lord Jaren has four allies, the four generals, Dorn, Calvin, Alwith, and Lysandra. And in our 1880s, Lord Jaren reopens the portal, discovers our world again, and starts stealing magic from our world and using it to wage war. Lord Jaren is already quite old at this point. Let's give him a little wrinkles. He wouldn't really have wrinkles. He'd hide those. He's quite old at this point, nearly at the point of death, but he has been using experimental magic to extend his life, which is also used on the four generals. This inner circle is always trying to find ways to achieve immortality, or at least very long life. The War of the Crystals is about the 1830s, so it's now the 1880s. They've started using our technology, and that leads us to the timeline of the Broken Queen, which takes place around 1895. So they've been importing our technology for over a decade, and they're starting to truly enter an industrialized age, but they've been trying their best to keep it secret. I mean, not that you can totally hide steamships and factories and all that, but, you know, they're trying to keep their methods secret as much as possible, and they have not been showing their hand too much. They have not gone to war. But the Miralem are very tense because, of course, the War of the Crystals, they actually managed to get a hold of one of the crystals. The Miralem don't really trust these people very much, and for good reason. They are the most powerful Daramons that the world has ever seen. But in the Broken Queen, we head over to the Dragon Kingdom, which is very isolated, and they really have very little idea of what's going on in the Daramon kingdoms. Dragon Kingdom is, the home of the dragons. The dragons travel all over the Miralem world and protect the Miralem kingdoms, but this is their home base. This is where their eggs are kept, and there has kind of been some sort of curse or darkness on the kingdom, which actually this is more ancient magic that they are dealing with. So while these dudes are modernizing, they are dealing with some leftover dark magic from a very long time ago. And the Black General, Dorn Dresdel, has learned about this ancient magic and is figuring out ways to exploit it for his own use. The second book in the series, which is what I'm working on now, will show some of the relationships of the four generals, who are all very old at this point, but are holding on to their power and youth and vitality for dear life. And the next book in the sequence, which was the first one I wrote, getting back to that, I didn't mean to get off track, but again, this is a lot of thoughts to figure out, guys. So the Cursed Soul trilogy takes place in like the mid-1910s. I can't remember the exact year. I'd have to look it up, but I think it's like 1916 or something when the Cursed Soul trilogy takes place. And, you know, obviously they're not using our years, but I will just for the sake of keeping things straight. I was going to draw Lysandra, the Red General, but I don't really know how she keeps her hair. Probably short. Let's give her kind of a little, no, she probably wouldn't keep it short. She'd probably just keep it in a braid. She really wants to just kind of be a strategist. She is not a fancy kind of lady. So the Cursed Soul trilogy is the story of Grau and Velsa. Velsa was born as a Finarlum or a doll person, and she was raised in slavery to be a concubine who would be bought by a man and would be forced to, you know, do whatever he wants to her. But instead she's bought by Grau, who is a sorcerer and an unusually enlightened man for a Darmon, because otherwise this story would be very depressing. And Velsa has been told all her life that she has a tainted soul because she is a Finarlum. And Grau, for that matter, has also been told that Finarlum have tainted souls. But as soon as he sees Velsa, he recognizes that she is a kindred spirit, and he just doesn't believe that she could possibly have a tainted soul. So this trilogy is the story of these two trying to find where in the world and how can they live so that they can be equal partners and have the life that they want. It takes them to various places in the world and puts them in a considerable amount of danger here and there, including putting her right in the path of Calvin the Peacock General, also wearing a little practical outfit here. And Velsa and Grau's story is very intimate, but it's set against the backdrop of the war, which at this point, the war that was brewing in the Broken Queen is going on in earnest. There is intense tension at the border and isolated fighting, which escalates throughout the series. And then finally, we have, taking place around 1923, we have Doll Girl meets Dead Guy, which is the story of Velsa's adopted Finarlum daughter, Sorla. They adopt Sorla in The Sorcerer's Wife, and she is a very, very plucky and determined kind of girl. And her story is more of a kind of slice of life affair. But as her book takes place, the war is ending, and the Miralem are forced to surrender and have a peace treaty, which is not on the terms that they would really favor. Particularly, Finarlum slavery is still legal, much to the dismay of Velsa and Sorla and everybody else who, you know, cares about this sort of thing, which is pretty much all of our main characters, because we're not going to write about terrible people. Actually, sometimes we're totally going to write about terrible people. They're pretty interesting, but so that's what I've done so far. And generally, my plan for this story is that I have kind of the main through plot, which has stories that get a little more intense, are a little more kind of traditional fantasy storytelling. And then there's the ones that are more the slice of life stories that fill in the background of side characters that you meet along the way. And to me, those are kind of like, the more slice of life you get, the more it starts to feel like a manga to me, where you might have like kind of a background plot that's important, but it's really more about the characters feeling like you're home while you're reading it. So one of the questions that I've been pondering is, how much do I tell of the main plot? Do I go just straight through the main plot and then go back and fill in later with these little side stories? Or do I go in more like consecutive order? And I'm probably going to do a mix of both, because I can't really see wrapping up the main plot line like just going straight like an arrow right to the conclusion. As many of you know, one of my favorite stories is the ElfQuest comics, which finally wrapped up after a very long time. And in the meantime, there were all these like side comics and little sort of one-shot stories and all kinds of things. So it feels like you're really on a journey before you get to the end. And that's kind of what I aspire to, is to tell like some of the big plot. We'll wrap up the war, and then we'll go back and fill in some of the side character stories before I tell the true ending. Because then I kind of feel like once you tell the ending, I mean, even though you could go farther from that, it really does take a little bit of the wind out of the sails of a story. Whereas if you build up to the ending for a long time, it's not like everybody's going to follow all of this, but it gives the sense that you've really invested in a very rich world. Well, even if you only read like a third of the books, just knowing that there's all this out there and that there are things being referred to really gives it a sense of depth, I think. I don't know if I love the way I did his eyes this time, but there is Grau in his traditional sorcerer's Casimora headdress. I don't know if I love his face, but again, you know, these are not going to be perfect pictures because I'm trying to talk about like important stuff while I'm drawing them, and they're just kind of off the cuff. It's actually surprisingly hard to talk while you're drawing, is what I'm learning from this video. I suppose I get better at it if I do more of these. Okay, so anyway, here's the books that are already out. Which one should you read first? It could really be any of them. It depends whether you want to go consecutively and start with The Broken Queen, whether you want to read the one that I wrote first, or if you'd rather dip your toe in with a bit of a smaller standalone story. And I would say to read whichever one draws you in. Although I didn't really get into the plots of them in this video. I'm actually mainly just trying to explain the overview of like where each book fits into the world. But this one's a little more like epic romantic fantasy. This one is a little more small scale, but has some epic fantasy elements, and it's really more of the story of a marriage and a coming of age for Velsa. And then Doll Girl Meets Dead Guy is comforting. It's a comforting romance with a lot of cute little world building stuff. So I did end up rating things kind of out of order, and that was on me because I originally was rating much farther in the timeline. Then I went back and I thought I should start earlier on. Then I wrote the Cursed Soul trilogy and Doll Girl. But after that, I was like, you know what? The story I really need to tell before I move on is the story of the Dragon Kingdom. Because it becomes important again, eventually. This is a terrible sigh we had. Bleh. Okay, so for here on out, at least the main plot ought to be in order. So I need to go back a little bit and return to Dormangara and Kessley. I think their story takes place starting around 1917. They appear a little bit in The Sorcerer's Equal, where they have a little bit of a romance going, but it's definitely a weird one. So Kessley comes from the river trader families. And when I first started writing her, I was thinking they're kind of like peddlers. They go up and down the river. And I was trying to decide what their vibe would be. And I realized they're kind of like working class, mid-Atlantic to like Boston. Like these are people that have a lot of street savvy, but they are broke and they're good at making deals. And they're a little hard edge, but very friendly, a little clannish. Probably have some kind of, a lot of like superstitions and stuff. And they're a fun time. Probably, I think of Kessley's family maybe as like they could be characters from Always Sunny in Philadelphia. So you got Kessley, and you know, she's kind of like the hometown girl who made good. She's a very good water sorceress, and so she was one of the first wave of women invited to join Lord Jaren's navy. But there was a guy on the ship who tried to harass her, and she was not having it, so she threw him overboard and killed him, and that was not a good move considering the culture of the Darmans. So they put her in prison, and the Peacock General was experimenting on prisoners to try to figure out shape-shifting into animals. So Kessley was one of the people that he just happened to experiment on. Nothing personal, you know. But she gets stuck with the spirit of a giant bird living inside, like sharing a body with her, and she has a lot of trouble controlling the giant bird. Velsa and Grau meet her, and she basically just has wings instead of arms because she's having a hard time shape-shifting back. And even then, she ends up getting stuck with a wing for a very long time because she can't seem to shake off the bird. This is obviously super awkward, bad for your romantic life to have a bird wing. Not that many guys want a big bird wing in bed, but there might be one weirdo who does, and that is Dormangara, who was all about the weirdos. And Dormangara is the Keeper of the Dead. Whoops, no, we don't like that chin line. The Keeper of the Dead is kind of like the Grim Reaper. He has one of the great crystals in his house, and he feels every dead person. Well, he feels every person dying. So you can go to him and ask him if someone died or not, and he will know, because he's felt everyone die. And he has a lot to recommend him as a husband. He's, you know, he's handsome if you like dour, pale men. He's kind. He has kind of a droll sense of humor. But, you know, it takes a little while to get to those good qualities because he is very, very reserved on the exterior. And he also has the skeletons of all of his predecessors on display in his house, dressed in moldering clothes, which is the tradition. But, you know, not every woman really wants her home decorated with the skeletons of the ancestors. So Kessley's not quite sure about him, but you know, they undoubtedly have some chemistry. And she ends up going to him and asking for help getting out of the bird predicament because he's such a powerful sorcerer. She figures that he will know, and he offers to help her if she will marry him because he needs an heir. She gives him kind of a tentative yes, and they end up getting tangled up in the thick of the war in the kingdom of Awry, which is on the border, right on the river where a lot of the action is happening. Their romance will unfold against that backdrop. And they also have the problem that neither of them really want a kid. Neither of them are small child people. I feel like I should give Kessley like a beer. Let's give her a big old flask to slosh around. She needs a drink. So I won't get too deep into the plot, but they end up adopting a Finarlum to get around this problem. Well, mainly because they meet a little Finarlum boy who has been rescued from slavery, which is a common problem at this point after the war and, you know, during the end of the war. The Miralum end up liberating a lot of the Finarlum slaves, some of whom are children, and then they're like, well, we need homes for these kids. We did this thing, and now, like, does anybody want to take these kids? So there's a lot of Finarlum kids that need adoption, and Kessley and Dormangara, who think they don't want a kid, both end up being attracted to a small, strange, doll person child to be their heir. And this is Anubis. Anubis is the keeper of the dead for most of the timeline that I've been writing. I created him in like 1997 or something. He's been around for a long time. I kind of messed up on his eyes, but I mentioned him in one of my videos before. He is very cute. He's cute forever. He does not really, like, he wants to grow up in the sense that he's actually has a very good head on his shoulders as he gets older, but he never really gets like an adult body, and he stays very cute and asexual for his whole life. In a lot of ways, Anubis is kind of the beginning of Finarlum having their own culture where they're kind of like, let's be whatever we want to be. We don't have to necessarily grow up. We don't have to stick to one gender. We can do whatever. I don't know why I gave him that neckline. I don't like that. He's just the sweetest, but at the same time, he knows that being an eternal doll child who can feel all the dying people in the world is pretty creepy at the same time. And so he kind of uses this to his advantage throughout his life, that he knows he can creep somebody out if he wants to. Anubis, I don't think requires like his own mega story, but he's a very important character. Kessley and Dormangara are also going to run into a young priestess of Valamir, the moon goddess, Viravissa, and that leads us into the next phase of the plot. At this point, we get into about the 1940s, and we have the story of Det and Viravissa. If you've watched my old notebooks videos, you know that Det is one of the oldest characters, and his earliest origins are pretty silly, as you might imagine, for things that you create when you're 13. But this is the modern version of Det. And this is a story I'm not sure that I should really tell in sequence because it's a very long character arc, and this part of it does not really end happily necessarily. I mean, there are some parts of it that are positive, but it's not like a fantasy romance on the surface like my other books. It is definitely a more complicated and conflicted story, and also perhaps a little darker at this point, because Det was born with extremely powerful telepathy. It's very rare, but once in a while, some people are born with what's called hypersensitive telepathy, where it's like they can't even turn it off. Their telepathy is just always going. They'll read people's minds on accident. They will attack people with, you know, one negative emotion. They're kind of dangerous. A lot of times they end up going kind of crazy. But Det is a young man, and Viravissa meets him, and he's also half Darmon. He's half Darmon, half Miralim, and his mother was murdered. He's living in a very violent neighborhood in Atlantis, and his family is very poor, and he's lost his mother. It's really like a very plot line you come up with when you're 13. Kind of an Anakin Skywalker situation where his mom was killed and they're poor. So now he kind of wants revenge on everyone because he had this traumatizing childhood, which is another reason I don't necessarily want to tell that story at this point, because I don't know. There's a reason like the Star Wars prequels work better coming out after the main story. I feel like if we had just seen the story of Anakin first, that would be really a bummer. Not that Det goes in the Anakin direction. He does not. Vera Vissa recognizes that such a powerful telepath might need some help from the priestesses, and she tries to help him. But the priestesses also kind of want to use Det, and at the same time, Vera Vissa gets kind of into him. I should probably start spelling her name with 2 S's, even though I've always only used one, but it looks like Vera Vissa. It's Vera Vissa. So at this point, we just have Det as a young troubled man with too much power for his own good. And, you know, the thing about Det, though, is that he does really want to help the downtrodden. He's definitely like a man of the people. He's just got a lot of baggage, and he ends up becoming a politician, running based on his incredible, oh my gosh, I messed up his eyebrows. But anyway, he's running based on his incredible telepathic charisma and gets elected as a very unlikely political candidate. This is not a good Det. I'm going to start over. Well, you know, basically Det doesn't really listen to anyone. He does his own thing and becomes a politician, and he uses some pretty underhanded means to achieve some pretty good things that I would probably support heartily. And if we skip over his origin story for now in the actual story part, we will get to the 1960s. 1940s through 1960s, at which point Det is the first half Miralim man to be elected to the political council that runs the Darmon nations. He has some very unlikely political victories and manages to abolish Fenarlim slavery, among other things. The world has been getting more westernized, so Det is a necktie guy, as well as a suspenders guy. Det always ends up looking like David Bowie in 1975 throughout his life somehow, which was... I'd never actually seen David Bowie when I designed him, but that's his vibe. The man who fell to earth / kind of that Coke Bowie style. Alright, so now we have the 1960s, and here's where we get back to Alfred and his crew, who I wrote about in The Vengeful Half, which was the first self-published book that I released, and it failed terribly. And I wrote it as a young adult, even though originally the characters were adults. So anyway, I want to get back to them, but with all of the knowledge I've accumulated, and now with all the background of what has come before, I think their story is going to make more sense. In the 1960s, the wars have all ended, and modern culture is starting to become widespread. All of the cities have train service and electricity and radio and movie theaters, all that stuff that you would have in the 60s. And a lot of the very powerful magic that was used so much in the war and was very common has now become illegal after the war as the world becomes a little more civilized, shall we say. And so there is now, this is definitely not the best shot of Alfred here, but powerful magic is now illegal. And so Atlantis, all these merchant families that have ruled Atlantis for a very long time, that have always been a little bit shady, but were on the up and up before. They are now just the straight up organized crime families, and they are dealing in all the magic that was made illegal after the war. And Alfred is the eldest son of one of these families. Alfred has almost no magical powers. He is just a very good schmoozer, basically. His superpower is his ability to get people to trust and like him. And he was blinded as a baby by one of the ancestral curses that were flying around during the war. And the way ancestral curses work is they're not like a widespread curse that you'd cast on the battlefield. They're more like an assassination attempt, very small and deliberate and targeted. And they curse someone and also make it so that if they kill themselves or die, the curse passes on to their youngest descendant. So if you don't have any kids, you can just not, and the curse doesn't pass on. But if you do have kids, you're a bit screwed based on how Dharma culture is, because they're all about family honor. You really don't want to pass a curse on to your kid by dying. So Alfred's grandfather was cursed, and he already had kids, so he had to wait for one of his grandchildren to be born, of which Alfred was the first. And as soon as Alfred was born, he killed himself and passed on the curse, like, well, he can deal with it. At least it's not my own children, and he'll be, a baby, so he can figure it out. But this caused a lot of family anger. Alfred's mother has really never forgiven the grandfather for blinding her baby and not one of the other offspring. Alfred's parents have been searching for a cure for this curse forever. It requires finding the person who cast the curse or one of their descendants. Wow, what a terrible looking hand. So they've been looking for a cure. They haven't succeeded. Meanwhile, Alfred is totally an adult now and does not want to mess with the lifestyle he's grown used to. He's totally used to being blind and doesn't really want to figure out what it's like to change something so major, especially because he's pretty good at what he does. He's good at schmoozing and working deals. Nevertheless, his parents find the daughter of the woman who cast the curse, and that is Olivia, whose name really needs to change because not everybody can have an Earth name. I named these people before I really thought about this kind of thing. Alfred's name makes sense because I can totally see his parents being into British culture and naming their children after British names, but Olivia needs like a good traditional name. Olivia's mother was a powerful sorceress, telepath, whatever, but Olivia herself was living kind of a humble life, probably working with plants or something. And Alfred finds her instantly attractive. Even though he doesn't want the curse removed. He's been pressured into an arranged engagement that he's really not into, and so when he meets Olivia, who is just a very real sort of person, he wants to hang out a little more. So he ends up involving her in his crazy and dangerous organized crime life. And if you're wondering how this relates to everything else, well, it definitely does. I have not forgotten about all the characters that I've already established. So Alfred's fiance, Thessia, she is betrothed to Alfred, but she really has an absolutely massive crush on Lester Allamont, who is kind of the pariah at her magic. She goes to some fancy school that teaches you magic and, other stuff. It's your fancy college for the rich and powerful. And there is one Finarlan boy who goes to this school who basically insisted on going to the school just to be a rabble rouser and was let in because his father is the keeper of the dead, Anubis. There is Thessia and her forbidden crush on Lester Allamont. Lester is the son of the world's most adorable little parents. But Lester himself, he really wants to be like a man. He wants to be a badass. Lucky for him, he has a lot of inherent talent, so even though he doesn't look that threatening, you really don't want to mess with Lester. I'm probably going to have to change his name too. I don't know why I have this habit of naming characters kind of like dorky names like Alfred and Lester, not like the hot romance novel names for you, really. So this really turns into kind of a fun gang of misfits story where ultimately this crew ends up recruiting a lot of ignored potion makers and sorcerers, and by sourcing magic for the organized crime business that a lot of people are ignoring out of prejudice, they end up building a rather powerful operation. And this is the same time that debt is on the council and there is a real revolutionary spirit in the air, kind of like, the 60s were in our world, but the vibe is, it's not the same. They don't really end up having hippies exactly. Well, they may have a couple hippies. Thessia and Lester, incidentally, both love Det and think that he is the greatest because, of course, he's pushing for the rights of women and Finarlem. But what Det doesn't really like is the organized crime in Atlantis, because Det does not approve of anything that makes a handful of families wealthy and powerful and leaves everybody else in the dust. So the Alfred team nevertheless has some conflict with Det. Det pushes out a lot of laws that benefit the people, but ultimately he's very controversial and he has a dramatic political fall. This is where the story gets a little more uncertain to me. I know where I want to end it at, but it's hard to see this far in the future as far as where it's going from here. This is probably where I'm going to get back to the character of Leo, who in the story originally was just a musician dude with musician dude friends. He is also the illegitimate son of Det. And the way Leo's story is set up, he has the potential to be kind of a bridge character between Lord Jaren and his 4 generals who are still kicking around. They're probably responsible for the downfall of Det. At this point, they're very old and are probably perceived as like they're just going to be there forever. Immortal and untouchable. Like, just think how long it takes to get rid of members of Congress and not the real world, and then imagine if they just never died ever. Every great upheaval that has happened has been thanks to Lord Jaren and the generals up until the rise of Det. And they still command tremendous respect and power, even though they're not political rulers. They kind of have that vibe like they're almost like the Illuminati or something, except everybody knows about them. They pull a lot of strings behind the scenes. After I tell the story of Alfred's crew, I might get on to touch base with what's going on over there, and I might end up using Leo as an avenue to do that. And that would probably take place in the 1990s. By the way, this is not the greatest picture, but this is Mrira, aka Cherry Doll, who is the first Finarlem pop star in the 60s and has both a female and male identity. So Leo himself will probably change a lot, and Leo's story will change a lot, but I have some ideas. And then after Leo and his friends, then it will be time to move into kind of the modern era, maybe the 2010s, and bring the whole thing to kind of a conclusion. I mean, I can easily see going on past that, but I at least want to tell the main arc that will wrap up things that were established throughout the entire series. But yeah, there'd be a lot of spoilers to talk about the ending, so we're not even going to talk about that at all. So that's the main story, and there's some side stories that I would like to get back to. Let's see how quickly I can draw their little heads. So first there's Parsons. I would love to get back to her. She shows up in The Sorcerer's Wife, and she's kind of like this prickly doll person girl who was born flesh and blood, and then she was in an accident that killed her mom, and her father had to turn her into a doll person to save her life, and that was pretty traumatizing for her. So she's just kind of prickly girl, but that's why it's fun to give her a romance. So yeah, there's Parsons' best friend, Els. She is a Halnari Marilyn. They are the only Marilyn that ally with the Daramons, and because of that, they are hated pretty much everywhere else in the Marilyn world. But Els is kind of rebellious Halnari in a lot of ways. I think it would be fun if she somehow ended up in the hands of the enemy, and, there was some kind of little romance with that, and it would bring up a lot of, cultural stuff. So I'd love to do something with her. Of course, I already started writing Una and Vari's story, and Doll Girl Meets Dead Guy. He's the main guy. Una is his very dreamy sister who loves to read. She's a total romantic and has this whole idea of some broody dude who's gonna marry her, but most of the guys died in the war, and Una herself is kind of a little socially awkward. So she is very single, and she is liked by Vari, who is just the sweetest, most kind and somewhat naive boy. Not her type, or so she thinks, but Vari gets lost in the war, and Una ends up looking for him. That's not a good Una either. It's very hard to draw people quickly. And then I might do just a little one-shot about Anubis and his adorable little relationship that he falls into with his, I don't know if they even get married, but his partner. And then one about Cherry Doll. And then I'm sure there's going to be other characters that just pop up over the years of writing this, just like I never imagined Parsons or Els or Una until I wrote the stories, and then their characters kind of popped up and I wanted to know more about them. So undoubtedly there will be more characters that arise like that. Okay, so that's the rundown, and I'm not sure this video worked out very well. It was kind of an experiment. You know, I promised myself when I started this channel that the first year would just be for experimentation, and sometimes it ended up being really hard to do because the channel grew so fast, and it makes it a little harder to feel like you can just try things, but I'm committed to still try things, and I hope that you hated it because it took forever. And my hand is so tired. But I did want to outline like my broad vision for the Hidden Lands, just in case anybody's curious and wants to follow along with how it shapes up, and as I'm showing my old notebooks and sketchbooks and talking about my future plans. This kind of gives you an overview of what I'm planning ultimately, which sometimes I feel like that context might be helpful if anybody really wants to nerd out about this with me. I know that will be a relatively small amount of people, but you know, kind of one's all you need for it to be worth it. One of the things I really wanted to get back to is that sense of like just the joy of creation when you're talking to a friend and you're both just nerding out over a fantasy world. When I was in my teens and early 20s, I feel like a lot of my creativity was just that like nerdy sharing of ideas that was very unself-conscious, and I miss that sometimes. So I still want to make videos sometimes that feel a little indulgent and like I'm just a 19-year-old who just wants to talk your ear off about stuff. And if you do end up being along for the ride, I will be extremely honored. That's all I could really ask for. And things will definitely change as I write it, but that's my broad idea, and I hope to see you for some of it. If you want to read any of the books that I have out now, they're linked in the description. Thank you so much for watching and supporting this channel, and I will see you next time. Bye.